SB9 法案全解析讲座。
Hi everyone, can you see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, great. So thank you for joining me on a sunny Saturday afternoon to talk about planning and zoning. Who knew that housing laws would suddenly become such an exciting topic? But before we begin, please let me introduce myself. My name is Melanie Griswold, and I've been the responsible broker for SALA HOMES Group since last year. As mentioned, I'm a lawyer, developer, and land use consultant, and my focus for the last several years has been on how to utilize state laws to increase the economic viability of projects and to get projects approved faster and with less hiccups. I've applied these laws to small subdivisions as well as to complex projects like the Gateway at Millbrae BART hotel, office, market rate, and affordable project that I worked on last year. As a lawyer and land use consultant, I've been watching the new round of housing bills very closely, but I have gotten excited about bills in the past, and so many of them up until now have failed. Recently, however, we seem to have reached a tipping point. Housing has become a top priority for Californians. California is an incredibly wealthy state, but yet we still have the highest percentage of people in the United States spending more than 30% of their income on housing. And unfortunately, the problem just seems to be getting worse. Check out this 2019 article from Bloomberg News complaining about the median price of housing at $600,000. Now, that seems like a steal. Just last month, the median home price set a new record at $825,000, which is a 30% jump and well below the cost of most homes in Silicon Valley. So why are we in this situation? The problem is that for many, many years, supply has not kept up with demand. California has the 49th lowest number of housing units per resident of any other state. This in turn translates into a deficit of 3 to 4 million housing units currently. And this is to say nothing of the 2.5 million housing units that are estimated to be needed over the next 5 to 7 years to keep up with demand. So where does planning and zoning come into play? Under state law, every city and county is required to plan and zone for their fair share of housing, with the fair share being determined by the state in what we call a RHNA allocation, also known as a Regional Housing Needs Allocation. So let's see whether our production is meeting the planning and zoning framework that the cities have supposedly designed to produce their fair share of housing. And as you can see, we're not doing very well. In the Bay Area, we have only produced about 67% of what is needed to keep up with the 2015 to 2023 RHNA allocations. And this is to say nothing of what is needed to catch up. When we drill down into what is being built, the problem gets worse. The only place where we are keeping up with demand is luxury units for high-income earners. And I suspect that we would also find that most of these luxury units are also for rent, not for sale. At the very low income level, which is our construction workers, restaurant workers, childcare providers, we've built less than 17% of what is needed. And at the moderate income level, which is your teachers, social workers, police officers, it is at about 40% of what's needed. In short, home ownership is becoming more and more unattainable, if not impossible, for most Californians. So why is this? You would think that if cities have planned for it, or if they have zoned for it, it would be built, right? Wrong. There are so many barriers to development. Permits can take 3+ years to get approvals, if you are lucky. The Millbrae BART project that I worked on had a 9-year permitting process. And if you can actually get the project approved, that's another thing. I worked on a project in Mountain View that was also in permitting status for over 4 years, and we're still struggling to get that project approved. Development standards are subjective, and this makes the whole process very uncertain. Then you add on CEQA review, which is the environmental review, and this adds a huge amount of cost and time to the process. And then there are impact fees. And while the concept that new construction should pay its fair share of services, in practice, these fees can add $100,000 to $200,000 per apartment unit. And that's before you factor in the cost of land and the cost to build. So all of this makes it very, very difficult to do any development unless you're building high margin housing like luxury apartments. So is there any hope for California's housing crisis? Well, I think so. And housing legislation is seen as a solution. Every year, more and more helpful legislation has been passed. And this year alone, Governor Newsom signed 31 housing-related bills into law. These bills touch on fairness and impact fees, streamlining of environmental review, objective standards, intensification of uses by right, and provide plenty of legal tools for developers to defeat NIMBYs. But let's turn to SB9, which is the star of the legislative show. So the headline is that SB9 spells the end of single-family zoning. The reality is that SB9 will allow property owners to potentially split a residential parcel into two lots and then potentially to have 2 units on each lot. So why do I say potentially? I say that because SB9 is simple in theory, but it is tricky to implement. So much so that a recent study by the Turner Center for Housing Innovation at UC Berkeley estimated that just 5.4% of the state's single-family lots have the potential to be developed under SB9. So are you going to see fourplexes everywhere? It doesn't seem so. But are there going to be some great opportunities with SB9? Definitely. So let's take a deeper dive into SB9. Where can SB9 be used? Who can use SB9? What can be built? And what is the difference between an urban lot split versus 2 units per lot? Where can you use SB9? Within a single family zone is what are the properties that qualify. It applies only to urban areas, and among other things, the property needs to meet a checklist under the government code. I've only included a few of the items there, but there are a number of items that would potentially exclude a particular property from being eligible. The minimum lot size after a split must be at least 1,200 square feet. So that means that you need to have a property that's at least 2,400 square feet. And you cannot have used SB9 on the same property before, and you can't use SB9 to split a lot if you have also split an adjoining parcel with SB9. So please note that this is not a complete list, but just a general overview. You will definitely want to consult with counsel before purchasing any property with an expectation that you can use SB9 to add more units. Properties that have existing housing on it also have very stringent requirements related to the demolition and alteration of that property. If the property's been tenant occupied in the last 3 years or withdrawn from the rental pool within the last 15 years, the split or SB9 process cannot demolish or alter that property. SB9 will also not allow you to alter or demolish historic structures, housing subject to rent control, and it precludes, I'm sorry, I jumped ahead too quickly. It precludes properties where the process would involve the demolition of more than 25% of the exterior walls or alteration. There are some exceptions to this, but that's sort of the general overview and the things to keep in mind. So let's look at who can use SB9. So SB9 can be used both by owner occupants and developers if they have not used an urban lot split on an adjacent property. So why did I put the asterisk there? Well, it's not quite as simple as any owner and developer can use SB9. The law was specifically written to preclude big developers and housing conglomerates like BlackRock from buying up single-family homes and making fourplexes on all of our single-family properties. So generally, owners and developers cannot split a property or lot without a cooperating applicant who will live in a home or unit on the property for at least 3 years after the lot split. So what that means is that SB9 will be most applicable to owners who have a property and who want to remain in a unit on the site, or to folks who are developers who are going to work with a buyer to find SB9 eligible properties, and that buyer would be part of the applicant team and would live in the property after it is developed. So let's talk about the two types of intensification allowed under SB9. So there's lot splits and 2 units per lot. So what is the difference there? So again, here I'm going to just provide a very basic overview, and there are many nuances and details that should be discussed with an attorney. But basically, a lot split can result in what we think of as typical separate lots, especially if they have their own street access. Within the 2 units on one lot, while the homes may look and feel as if they're single families and the units can be sold separately, there will need to be an HOA and CC&Rs to address common maintenance areas. So the 2 units doesn't necessarily need to be a duplex, but by virtue of the fact that there are 2 units on a single property, you're going to have some elements that are going to be shared, and those shared elements like driveways, front landscape, or sidewalk are going to need to be addressed in an HOA and your CC&Rs, which would be drafted by an attorney. So the ownership structure is a little bit different there with the lot split into units, even though you can have separate owners on both structures. The other difference is going to be with how development standards are applied. And under this section is really what determines what can be built once you do your lot split. And this area is an area that is where the real complexity of SB9 comes into play. So when you have a lot split, it will create new lot lines, and any new residence is going to need to comply with the applicable planning standards that apply to those lots. So for example, here in the bottom diagram, we see that there is a side setback with the 2 lots that is not present in the 2 unit version. So the S being the side setback here, F being the front, and R being the rear. And the same thing can go with the rear setback. When you split the lot, this may change where the setback is actually defined. So it might flip a property from having front setback becomes the side, and your side setback becomes the rear. And this can be really tricky if what happens when you flip those side setbacks is the setbacks no longer comply. And so the development standards here may not actually allow you to build that much, regardless of the setbacks. In some areas like Saratoga, for example, the percentage of square feet that you can build compared to the lot size, which is known as a floor area ratio or FAR, decreases with larger lots. When you split, you may have to apply the lower FAR percentage, even though your lot is smaller. And so you may actually be able to build far less than what you would think by splitting your property. And while there is an 800 square foot minimum, which is that the law says that you can build 800 square feet sort of irrespective of the development standards. Of course, that's with a few asterisks as well. But this might not be enough to make that true second home that can be sold, or it certainly might make it not in the range of the single family that you're expecting to sell for single family prices. So let's look at a real life example of how SB9 might work. So this is a property where I am working with a buyer and we are in contract on this property. It's a 0.44 acre lot in Los Altos, and it is a long, skinny parcel that is fronting onto North San Antonio Street, which is a very busy street. To the north of the property, there's a PG&E substation. To the south, there is multifamily, and to the rear, there's a single family neighborhood. This property is about 500 square feet short of being able to do a conforming lot split on it. So we got into contract hoping that we could increase the density through a general plan change, which is a zoning change, and that is a discretionary decision that we would have to go through and raise to City Council. And we learned during this process that the city was supportive of more housing on the site, but it was not supportive of a privately initiated general plan change. So even though they thought that the site should have a different designation, it wasn't willing to open the Pandora's box of allowing developers or applicants to seek a general plan change. They were going to consider changing it as part of the update to their housing element to meet their regional housing needs allocation, but there was no guarantee whether that would happen in the first year of the housing element cycle or the 8th year of the housing element cycle. And there was also no guarantee that they would in fact change the designation. So with that information, the buyer had decided to cancel the contract. And we were just about to cancel the contract and exercise our due diligence contingency when SB9 passed. When SB9 passed, they opted to move forward with the purchase in the hopes that SB9 can be applied and more units can be built. But there are challenges. This is a new law that has never been tested. So this is just a little summary of what is allowed currently. So as I mentioned, it is right now, it would just be a single family house and an ADU. Single family house could be up to 5,700 square feet. So it's a really large house, but this isn't really the best spot to put a luxury house, being next to the PG&E substation and on a busy road. And just as way of background, Los Altos, as some of you might know, has very, very restrictive zoning. So there's lots of single story overlays, there's low lot coverage ratios, large minimum lot size, and large setbacks as well that you need to comply with. So the challenge on this is that this law has never been tested. So on January 1st, 2022, when the law actually goes into effect, we are planning to file our application with the city. We know that the city is supportive of additional housing here. So that is a good thing to be going in with, at least knowing that there's some support for this project. But generally, cities are, especially some of the areas where you have traditional single family zoning and some of the higher value areas, cities are very much opposed to eliminating the single family zoning, which is part of the reason why the state acted through this top-down legislation. So for example, in some areas, we already know that cities are sort of actively working to come up with some ways to get around what people might want to do with SB9. Another challenge is that, well, we know we have the 800 square foot minimum available to us on a lot split. That really is not a economically, might provide a little bit of value on this lot, but it really doesn't boost the value like we would want. Another issue for this particular property is that it was tenant occupied. So it was tenant occupied through June of 2020. So in order for us to take advantage of SB9, we either need to leave the house completely intact or we need to leave it vacant for a year and a half. So that is a challenge on this property. And I'm just illustrating this so that if you're thinking about making the decision to purchase something, these are some things that might trigger some questions for you or further investigation. The other tricky part or thing that we need to think about is owner-occupant participation. So the buyers on this property do not live in the area and are not planning on living in the area. So part of our decision to go forward with this was whether we had another potential partner who would be willing to own or occupy part of the property. And we have found somebody who is interested in doing this. It's a good deal for that person. They can get into Los Altos at a price that they wouldn't have been able to afford sort of but for this partnership situation. And it's a good opportunity for the investor partner in that they now have somebody who can meet one of the requirements for the lot split. But as you see from this diagram, another issue is that the lot split does need to be at least a 60-40 ratio. And what we see here, we have a house that we cannot demolish running right through the lot. So we're going to have to sort of address all of these different issues and be strategic in how we approach the property. And what it will likely mean is that you don't get your 4 units on this particular property. Maybe it's just 2 or potentially it's 3, but we're working that out now with an architect. But the reality, even with the challenges for the Los Altos property and other challenges on other properties, there's an enormous upside here. One house at 5,700 square feet might be worth $5 million or $4.5 million in Los Altos in this area. But whereas 3 homes at 1,900 square feet, because I don't think that we're going to be able to increase the building square footage here, are probably worth closer to $2.5 million each or $7.5 million total. So a really good upside from being able to utilize SB9 on this particular parcel. But of course, we'll see how this plays out. And with all good opportunities, there is plenty of risk as a real estate developer. So in short, I hope this has been helpful. If you have any questions, I will be here to answer what I can. For more detailed questions, or if you're interested in pursuing an SB9 property as a buyer, if you have a property where you'd like to add more units, my development partner, Stephanie, and I can be reached at the number and email on the screen. But with that, I'm here to answer any questions that you might have.
And I have a question. So, may I ask a question? Like, say, for example, there are community with HOAs. Can the HOA rules override SB9, or maybe because they don't apply? Because with HOA, these single-family houses typically they cannot really do any kind of development over there, right? So, with this new legislation, is that possible to override these HOA rules?
So I think that is one of the many questions that is still open to interpretation. So the law says that it applies to properties with single family zoning. A lot of the HOAs will probably have PD or planned development zoning. And so an argument could be made that it actually doesn't apply to that PD zoning potentially. With the ADUs, that was also an open issue. And then the legislature clarified it later and said that ADU law did apply to HOAs, although in practice, I'm not sure actually how that works. So I think that it is unclear and whether you'd be able to do it on a property where you had a planned development zoning or anything that wasn't your traditional R18, R110, R140 zoning.
Thank you.
May I ask a question?
Yes, of course.
Yeah. It's like how many houses do you think can be turned into 2 lots? Like in reality, because like I think most of the houses they have a front yard, backyard, and if you don't tear down the whole house, you cannot split them into 2, right? I don't know how much how many houses will be actually influenced by this SB9.
Yeah, I think that it is going to be a lower percentage, like what that study from UC Berkeley thought, around like the 5% mark. The larger the home on the property, the less as a percentage of the overall property, the less likely I think that you're going to be able to do it, unless you potentially convert the home into a duplex or something of that nature. If you have properties that are wider with more frontage on a street, or some property, like some corner properties, I think those are going to be better candidates for this sort of law. The other aspect is that for the 2 units on a single property, they don't need to have street access necessarily. They just need to be able to pass, they don't need to front on a street. I apologize. It's not a street access. They need to have access to a public street, but they don't need to front on a public street. So you may have long, skinny parcels, kind of like what I was showing on Los Altos, where potentially you have a driveway or shared driveway that gives access to the various homes on the lot. But I think it's very dependent on what that parcel looks like, how much room there is, whether you can alter part of that house or not. And that's where it gets pretty tricky.
Okay. So do you think that the South Bay will finally become something like San Francisco? Like
no, I don't think so at all. I think that I think that the areas that are probably going to be more affected by this are Los Altos, Saratoga, places with larger lots, and where you just have more open space on it. But if you also have really great landscaping and a pool on there or a tennis court, you might not want to tear that down to split it, or it may not make sense. But in San Jose or in a lot of the South Bay where we have relatively small lots, it's just hard to get the access to the property to make multiple units make sense. And you're already paying a lot for whatever development is on there. So to tear it down, you need to boost the value. And unless you can get a lot more square footage, you may not be able to boost the value that much by converting it into multiple units.
Okay, thanks.
Hi, Melanie. This is Liang.
Hi.
Yeah, so I have a question. Suppose I have a pretty big lot, and now according to SB9, I can split it to 2 and build 2 units on each lot. Suppose actually, eventually I got 4 single-family homes on the original lot. So can I live in one of the single-family home and sell the other 3 separately?
Yes. SB9 was intended to allow you to sell the other homes. So it's a little different. Like the ADUs, you're not allowed to sell separately, as of at least the last round of laws. I think there might be some changes. It's hard to keep up with all of the changes, but this rule was intended to actually allow you to sell out the individual homes and parcels.
Yeah, thank you for the clarification, because previously I was listening to a YouTube video. A gentleman pretty much said that you can, of course, after you split a lot, you can sell the lot for sure. But if you build two units in a split lot, you cannot sell them separately. You have to sell those two units together. But now you're saying at least I can sell them separately. That's good news.
Yeah, I mean, I'll have to look at that more closely, but I think you need to map them so that you basically are creating condo units out of it, like what you would see in San Francisco when you actually have condos there, or potentially even you're selling it as a TIC sort of thing. I don't think that it can't be conveyed separately, like you have to sell it to the same owner, but it would involve some additional mapping work to be able to divide it into separate lots or units.
I don't quite understand. You said, my original question is if I have 4 single family homes, right? So, because if the lot is big enough, so you can actually build 4 single family homes on the original one lot.
Right.
But you said that by some measure, I can actually sell them separately. Okay, that's all I want to know.
Yeah, I think it's this is where even though you might have what seems like a single family, if it is a single family where it's on one parcel, like one lot, then that's where you need the HOA and CC&Rs, but you can still sell units separately in those types of developments. And so that's where you'd be able to sell it separately.
I see. Thank you. My second question is, suppose I have 2 lots that are not adjacent to each other. So according to the law, I can actually split them, right? So the question now is, because I have to sign an affidavit to live in one of the units for 3 years at least, which is fine, but I'm not sure. How about the other lot? I split it. Suppose I also build 4 units there, and I build 4 units here. I live in one of the units. I don't know how it works. Do I need to find someone who will actually sign the affidavit to live in a unit in another lot for 3 years? So how does it work?
Yes, you would need to, in order to do your lot split, you would need an owner applicant, or it's like they say an applicant occupier. And so you would need somebody who is working with you, who is going to live on the property for 3 years.
But I own 2 lots. So do I have to somehow sell the lot to that person?
So
how does it work?
The law doesn't actually say that the applicant needs to be on title. I know that it was intended to be written that it would be the owner, so somebody on title, that will actually occupy it afterwards. I think that will probably get corrected in some subsequent revisions to the law. But I think if you to comply with the spirit of what was intended and will likely be corrected, you would need to have somebody that has an interest in the property. So where you've assigned them or sold them a portion of your interest in the lot, and that you're working together. So you basically have a partnership going into the development, and that upon getting your approvals and actually being able to sell out the pieces individually, that person that you're partnering with would take or buy one of those lots and occupy it.
I see. Okay, thank you.
I have a follow-up question about the 3 years. How does 3 years work? If say the applicant did not live there for 3 years, then what happened? And who is going to enforce this rule? Is it on the city level, on the state level, or federal level? How does it work?
That is a very, very good question. I think there's no guidance as to who's going to enforce it or what the consequences are going to be. I would imagine that cities are going to enact some type of substantial penalty for non-compliance, so that people don't just put this affidavit in and then don't actually do it. I mean, it is under penalty of perjury, so theoretically you could be prosecuted by the state, at the county level for filing a perjured document. But I think what cities will probably do is put some type of huge penalty such that it's not worth it.
Also, this 3 years is after the applicant being filed, not before, right? It's like it's promise. I promise I will live.
Yes, yeah, exactly. It's kind of strange. And then the other thing that's strange is that you're supposed to live in the property for 3 years after the lot split happens. But some of these properties, you might be building the residence too. So I don't think it was intended that you have to live in the unit that's not going to be demolished or altered, but it's kind of written that way. So, that's another question that is somewhat open. My inclination or guess would be that as long as you live in one of the units that's built and you start building, you'll be okay. But, there's lots of questions and some things that need to still be defined.
Okay, thank you.
Hi, I have a question. Say I have a lot and it is subdivided 5 years ago, and now I have 2 parcels. Can I apply SB9 for each parcel?
So you cannot use SB9 for the lot split to both parcels because if they're adjoining. If they were not adjoining, then you could do it to both, like our previous caller. But the adjoining parcel provision, I do not think it is written into the 2 units on one parcel part of SB9. So, although I do think also that's going to be corrected. I think that's probably a mistake. So right now, as it's written, you should be able to build a second unit on an adjoining parcel, and then you'd be able to do a full SB9 potentially into your 4 units on the other parcel.
So in this case, how about he sell one of them to other people? Can the other people use SB9 to divide again?
Yeah, I mean, if you sell it to somebody else, they can do it, but you cannot be working in concert with them or in a partnership with them. So they have language there that if you're acting together with another person, then that wouldn't be allowed. But if you thought that your property was a good one for SB9, you could sell it to somebody independently, then for them to do SB9 on it.
So from what I read on the text is that the existing unit cannot be demolished. Maybe you can only demolish maybe 25% of the existing wall. So that means the existing unit must be kept there. Essentially, you need to build another unit there, right? You cannot actually demolish the current unit and then build two new homes. That's probably not going to work. Do I understand correctly?
Yeah, there are some ways around that. I think that there is some time limitations on it, and there may also be ways of structuring your application so that you do the demolition first before you apply SB9 or something of that in that way. But it does have that prohibition, or you might be able to do things afterwards. Like, for example, you get your lot split and record all your maps and do what you need to do, and then afterwards do whatever alterations you want to do to that property, because I don't think it was intended that you could never renovate or expand the current house.
Yeah, but essentially, there's a way. For example, you can, demolish the current house. Suppose your current house maybe just sitting in the middle of the house, so you cannot really build anything else. But maybe you can just demolish it and build it rebuild another one
Right.
just maybe on one side of the house, and that's perfectly legal, right? The current law. Right?
Yeah, I think that probably would be legal. I mean, I think even now you could, as it's written, demolish the house and then go and apply SB9. Although I do think that there's some risk there that the city would say that as part of this application you were demolishing the house, but technically you're not if the house is already demolished before you go and apply. So, I think some of these things will get worked out. But if you demolish your house, rebuilt it, and then applied SB9 after the house is built, that's pretty far in time from when when you were demolishing that house. So that's probably a pretty good faith, not that you're not altering the existing house as part of your application.
So you mentioned SB9 for single family house. Is it also applicable for multiple family zoning?
SB9 does not apply to properties that have multifamily zoning.
Okay, thank you.
Sorry. Yeah, I just want to double check. So with SB9, we don't need to meet the size requirement of our zoning, but we need to meet the setback requirement. Is that correct?
When you say the site, do you say the site requirement of the zoning?
I mean, if after subdivide, our site is smaller than what the zoning is required, that is fine. But we need to meet the setback requirement of that zone, zoning, right?
Yes, okay. You would. Yeah, so your lot doesn't need to conform to the lot standards because, well, obviously, if you could do a conforming lot split, you don't need SB9. You can just do your lot split. Mm-hmm. But it does, like the house that's built on there needs to conform to the zoning standards, except that if the zoning standards would not allow you to do at least 800 square feet, then you can disregard that kind of with a, as long as there's no like health and safety risks.
Okay, and also for the 2 units, because originally I saw that like on each of the parcel, you will be able to have 1 single family and 1 ADU. But according to a previous question, looks like you can have 2 single family on 1 parcel. So for like the second one, is there any like a size limitation like the ADU have?
So I think that they with the SB9, you can't do the lot split and ADU and two units on a lot. So if you do an ADU, then you can't do 2 units on the lot. But you're already doing a second unit, but your second unit is the ADU, not a separately conveyable unit. So I'm not sure why people would do ADU versus a second SB9 unit. I suppose ADUs have better rules on setbacks. So I could see a situation where someone wanted to do an ADU and was able to use like the 4-foot rear setbacks that they have for ADUs. But if they tried to do the same thing with a second unit under SB9, they wouldn't be able to because they wouldn't meet the development standards. So I could see a situation, I guess, where someone would choose an ADU over an SB9 unit. But yeah, you can't do like all 3. You can't have 4 units on 1 parcel plus an ADU.
So are there some land size requirements to build 2 units on 1 lot?
Let's see. I was going to actually check on that. That was one thing as I was doing this presentation that I was thinking about. I know that it's 1,200 square feet per unit for a lot split. So you need at least 2,400 square feet. But I am not sure if that same minimum lot size applies to 2 units on a single parcel or not.
Hi, Melanie. Another question. So I know we cannot, as an owner, we cannot subdivide adjacent lot if I already subdivided one lot. But this become a little tricky if I have two lots in hillside. If two lots, for example, if they are separate, if they don't have shared boundary, but they have no actual lot in between, they're separated by, let's say, 100 feet of open space, say. So I don't know, is this count as adjacent? Yeah, that's pretty much your question.
Yeah, I would have to look at probably the map and just see where it is. But if it's separated by something other than a shared property line, I don't think it'd be considered adjoining. But sometimes, like in some planning, like when you're looking at whether a property qualifies as being surrounded by urban or residential areas, you will not count streets or streams or things of that nature. So there is some, I guess there's some legal precedent that if what's separating your two properties is just like a open space or like some sort of natural, what do you call it, like a outcropping or something like that, that right, might be disregarded.
I see. Okay, yeah. Thank you.
Hi, Melanie. I do have a quick question. Do you think with single-family zones, the single families are going to become kind of multi-family afterwards? Do you think it actually affects people's perception for multi-family going forward? For example, maybe as long as you have land, no matter whether you're single family or multi-family now, but they can be treated equal, more like it's no longer about zoning, but about if you have land or not.
Yeah, I kind of do think that this will change people's perception. I think that people are pretty hysterical about their single family zoning. And like when we look at how the conversation was around ADUs when they first started, people were really afraid of what it was going to do. And largely people seem to really like them and they're very popular. And I think that with SB9, because you're not really allowing much additional square footage on a property. I mean, if 800 square feet is maybe the most that you can do extra, and that may not even apply. You're not really changing the massing. You're just creating some additional units within a particular property. So, I mean, I think that there's going to be some bad examples of it and that people will hate, and with good reason. And there'll be lots of good examples. And, but ultimately it does make some areas where there's really large lots, like, an acre or half an acre, where a quarter acre would probably be very nice for a lot of people. And that's going to make it more accessible to folks. So, I mean, I personally support it, but I also come from more of a pro-development space. And so I hope that people do nice developments and it'll be a good thing for California.
Got it. Thank you.
So, Melanie, I have two questions for you. One is, you said UC Berkeley study said 5% of the houses would be able to use SB9. Was that data for Bay Area or for the whole California? That's number one. Number two is, if people do use SB9, what do you think the impact on the prices for the houses in the Bay Area?
That's a really good question. So the first question was, I believe it was California-wide on the number of properties. And in terms of how many properties within the Bay Area, I think the properties where we have smaller lots are not going to be as good candidates for SB9. The larger lot properties will be. And but some of those are also in fire hazard zones too. So I'm not sure. I would probably be just guessing if I were to give a percentage for how many in the Bay Area. But in terms of the values, there may be more of a premium on some properties that are good candidates for SB9 for developers. So I could see that happening. But the values are so high already that I'm not sure that it's going to change it that much, because you have additional supply coming in that could theoretically bring the prices down. But on the other hand, these properties now have more profit in them. So developers, if it is developers or owners, may be willing to pay a little bit more. So I think, it sort of remains to be seen, but it also depends on how many properties come on the market where you can actually apply SB9 to them.
Thank you.
So for hazard zone, even the lot is large, people can still not use SB9. So what kind of hazard zone is that people cannot use that for SB9?
I'm sorry, what was that? You said what was not being applied?
Hazard zone.
Hazard.
Yeah.
So it in very high fire hazard zones, it's generally not allowed. It's also generally not allowed in zones that have significant flood risks. And then if it's in a designated earthquake fault zone, it is not allowed, but if it complies with building standards, it appears to be. So I'm not really sure. I've never had a situation with that one where I haven't been able to. That's one of those criteria that applies to some other development standards too in other areas of the law. So it seems like you can get around that by just making sure you follow the building codes, but I don't know why that rule is in there. So those are kind of the main three.
For ADU, there's no restriction, right? No hazard zone restriction for ADU.
I have not looked at that recently, so I'm not sure. I'd have to look and check on that.
Okay. So when you say big lots, how big the lots is above 7,000, above 8,000 considered to be big?
Well, part of it is going to be your shape of your lot. If you have a 8,000 square foot or 7,000 square foot lot that's really wide and that fronts on a street or that's in a corner where you can split it and give street access, that's going to be a more buildable lot than if you have to run a driveway to the back of it to give access to a rear unit. So it's going to be very dependent on the shape, dependent on how flat it is. But I tend to think that we're going to see it more on properties that are 15,000 square feet, 12, maybe actually probably about 10,000 square feet and above.
Yeah, so I agree with you, Melanie. So I actually have another idea. It's basically that I think the lots that's gonna be benefit from this change is that a very big lot, like you just said, but also very small lot. For example, the 2,400 square feet lot is gonna benefit a lot because then you can actually build 4 units, at least 4 units of 800 square feet, right? Before that, you cannot do that. Is that understanding right?
Yeah, that's a good point. You might be able to do that on some of the smaller units, of course, providing that you can. There's always a difference between what you can do theoretically and then what makes sense when you do the economics. And if you have to provide parking, and we've still got a pretty robust car culture in most areas, but like perhaps in San Francisco or other places, that adding that 800 square foot unit could be really valuable and worthwhile. So yeah, I think you're right. You know, on some, maybe on the small properties, it will provide some benefit as well as on the larger ones.
That's right. So I actually like your example of your client Los Altos lot. Your plan for it. It's a very good example. I actually have a thought about that. So how do you think about using SB10 on that lot? Because my understanding is that the city tend to like the idea of more house, but they don't want to do a general plan amendment, right? But SB10 now provide a tool for you actually to build 10 units. So are you actually advising that for that lot, or you only plan to do SB9?
Well, I wish on Los Altos we could do SB10, but SB10 is different from SB9. So SB9 actually was a rule that is now applicable as of January 1st to all developments. SB10 was a authorizing statute that cleared certain environmental requirements and made it easier for cities to enact their own rules to allow up to 10. So if a city doesn't want to do up to 10 units on a particular parcel, they don't actually have to do anything. So SB 10 doesn't do anything until a city actually allows you to do it. It just makes it easier for a city to do it if they want to.
That's right.
Thank you, Melanie. I think that's all the time we have today. Thank you so much for everyone for attending. 感谢大家参加今天的 webinar。接近2021年年底，我们会有密度很大的活动 seminar 年终回馈，同时也针对 SALA HOMES VIP 客户和合作伙伴也有特别的企划。欢迎大家在会后找我们聊天 ，SALA HOMES one-to-one 连接也会稍后放出。谢谢大家参加。
请问这个律师，如果我们跟他联系，可以吗？
你们可以就是通过微信加我们，然后我们可以就是跟你们联系上。
好的，好，因为他是 ADU 或者是 SB9 的专家，对不对？
对
，OK， 好的，谢谢。
Thank you very much.